So you must have come to see this beautiful loading screen.
Welcome to the loading panel. Thanks for bearing with us while we get all loaded up.
Well, I'm Darvo Prower, the game scene investigator, and here we have...
I'm Keith, the ghost of MAGFest, named as such because I don't really have anything to plug except for this one funny YouTube comment that we found when searching for loading screens. Darvo and I come to MAGFest. We've been coming here for like the last 10 years or so and doing panels for maybe the last 5, I want to say.
Sounds right.
And what we like to typically do is find an example of a concept or a mechanic that's present throughout many video games, catalog them, and then put them into sort of a little clip reel showcase that we can run through. But before we get into the actual clip reel itself here, we do have to address the elephant in the room, which is namely the fact that Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is notably poorly optimized, and it's not going to be discussed as part of this panel, okay? So if you came to sit through the 5-minute long Sonic 06 loading screens, you can leave now. We're not getting into it. It's also important to note that this isn't necessarily going to be a historical panel, nor are we really going to be analyzing the concept of loading or just looking at loading in general. We're primarily focusing on loading screens in games. There are going to be a couple of different loading tricks and strategies that devs implement that we'll look at a few examples of those, but primarily we're just going to be looking at the screens themselves. Now, we do have a little bit of historical context that we're going to kind of front load, looking at, for example, storage mediums on which games load from and the ways that impacts loading times, as well as a specific patent that really messed with video games and loading screens for a number of years. But just keep that in mind. It's not really going to be very historical. We're mostly just showcasing interesting examples of title screens here.
Yeah, for a very brief period of time when we were starting the research, we were looking to see if we could find like the first loading screen, and that was fruitless and boring. So
what software doesn't load something? You know,
yeah.
Loading is everywhere. So,
but the two major events, as Keith mentioned, were in this section called loading lore. So the first primary event that had a big effect on loading in games is the advent of early 3D gaming and the switch from cartridges to discs as the primary media that games were delivered on. Seriously, in the early thousands, everyone was obsessed with getting things on the little discs. I mean, look at the Bionicles from back then.
The discs were on everyone's mind.
And the Lego company wasn't the only games company interested in discs. Nintendo actually released an expansion for the original Famicom, the Japanese version of the NES, called the Famicom Disk System. And Metroid was actually originally developed for this. And here we're going to compare the NES and the Famicom Disk System versions of Metroid. So this is also the beginning of the elevator block. Elevators are sort of like a real-life loading screen, and Metroid utilizes this when switching between areas. It was very expansive for the time. All that's really happening is you're changing the colors of the tile set and loading in the new rooms, but this video hasn't stopped, by the way. That's just what the loading off of the Famicom Disk System looked like, and it couldn't even keep the elevator shaft on screen for all of it.
So they really needed to implement these elevators in the design of Metroid to account for that loading requirement, right? And you can kind of see the necessity for those elevators themselves sort of starting to go away once you move to a cartridge-based medium instead of a disc-based medium.
The Super Metroid, all versions of that didn't really need to spend any time loading in the different areas, but it also was just an immersive element and was something they wanted to preserve from the map of the first game, but it does a lot just aesthetically to sell the scope of the world. And another example in the series is Metroid Prime. This is the first disc-based Metroid game since the original, and likewise the loading screens masked through elevators are back. Interesting thing about this is one of the few times in the game where you really get a good look at Samus's 3D model, as the primary gameplay is all first person. So it's sort of letting you appreciate why it needs that extra time to load. Mm-hmm. And this trend has stuck around. It was sort of subverted in Metroid Fusion by being the primary part where your AI companion talks to you. One of the elevators breaks in the middle of it and adds some tension. And this trend continues to the most recent Metroid game, Metroid Dread. You'll notice there's something curious about the elevators in this one. So this is actually a really big innovation for the series. They've invented horizontal elevators, also known as trains.
Next level stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, moving on to another pointed example of the difference between cartridge and disc-based systems, we have Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, RPGs in general, really. So Chrono Trigger makes use of the cartridge-based format. It's obviously a SNES RPG. And they use that quick load ability to essentially allow for seamless battle transitions. In the overworld, enemies will just kind of jump out at you. There's no real transition to a different space or alternative battle screen or UI. Everything just kind of happens seamlessly within the overworld itself. And that can be kind of contrasted to some other older RPGs where you'll typically have a transitory screen, some kind of a screen wipe where the actual level layout changes and the enemies load in and whatnot. And what's interesting is when you look at the next entry in the Chrono series, Chrono Cross, where they move from cartridge to disc for PS1, battles are now all prefaced by these really long and kind of elaborate loading transitions where you get this filter effect and then the camera pans across the battlefield, giving the game time to load in the enemy assets and the player assets, while also kind of adding to the aesthetic quality of the game by just showing you everything with these nice cinematic pans over the area. And it just sort of demonstrates the kinds of aesthetic contributions that loading can make, even when it's a necessary evil. It doesn't have to just be boring. You can at least make it visually engaging.
Yeah, and just another example of how the media has so much of an impact on what the games can do with this. Another early 3D RPG, this one for the N64, so cartridge-based. You have Quest 64, and maybe they were trying to go for something similar to Chrono Trigger because the battles are happening in the overworld, not a sub-screen, and no loading. That was not a cut on our part. That's just they really did away with the transition battle swipe animation, and I think it adds something to have a little more than just the enemy popping in and the camera abruptly changing, even if it's impressive that these 3D models can load so quickly.
One frame you're walking, and the next there's enemies. No transition at all. It's very jarring.
Yeah. Now, one interesting example of media affecting loading that isn't the traditional disc or cartridge would have to be Invade-A-Load for the Commodore 64.
Yeah, so on the Commodore, games were loaded on analog cassette tapes, and you would have to load pretty much an entire game into memory in order to play it. And that could take a long time, like 5, 10, 15 minutes. So some games would come bundled with these little preload experiences. This is Invade-A-Load, obviously a little Space Invaders clone. And Invade-A-Load would be bundled with certain Commodore games. It would load up before the game itself that you had purchased, so that while the rest of the game was loading, you'd have something to play and distract yourself with. I don't know if it's a testament to the quality of Commodore games or if it, just speaks to how prevalent Space Invaders has been, but many people on forums talking about this mentioned that they actually would often boot up games with Invade-A-Load just to play Invade-A-Load instead of whatever game was bundled with it. So it's an interesting example of a very early kind of twist on loading and of forward-thinking devs trying to figure out what can we do to make this a little bit more interesting.
Now, you might be wondering, if they got that working on a cassette tape, why isn't that the gold standard? That's a pretty safe bet that gamers would like to play a game while they're waiting to play the other game.
Yeah, why is that not more common?
Yeah, so that brings us to the second primary event that affected the way that loading screens are done in games, the legality of such. So in 1998, Namco was granted a somewhat dubious patent on having loading screen mini games. You might notice that well before this patent was released, there was that Invade-A-Load example showing this was not proprietary technology or a unique idea they came up with. That's not strictly necessary for patents, and we could I'll do the patent law panel next year. But yeah, they basically got a patent saying that they have the rights to having a secondary game loading, or that you can play while the main game is loading, as shown by this little flow chart here.
Right. And secondary is key. It's games with different mechanics than the main game you're playing itself. So like if you're playing Space Invaders in a game that's otherwise a car racing game.
Yeah, and they've helpfully given that as the example. Game A in Figure 7 in the center, and this is what early racing games looked like, I suppose.
Curious how similar this is to the precedent we saw with Invade-A-Load from 1987, Namco.
Yeah, spaceship shooting little shape guys.
These figures are actually representing one of Namco's own games. Does anybody have a guess what this is referring to? You're absolutely right. It's Ridge Racer.
Yep.
Ridge Racer! This is the PS1 port of the original arcade version of Ridge Racer. And when you turn on the game, it actually first boots into a little Galaxian segment here. You can shoot at the enemies, and then once it's done, the game loads up, whether you've killed them all or not. If you actually beat all the enemies, though, in the allotted time, you end up unlocking 8 extra cars within Ridge Racer that are themed after classic Namco games. So there's like Xevious, Galaga, a bunch of different things, Bosconian. I mean, so it's a nice little time killer for one, but it's also unique in that it unlocks content in the main game if you engage with that little loading section. And then another example, also from Namco, this is a little Namco block here. They kind of continued expanding on this format so that they could hold on to that patent of theirs. Tekken on the PlayStation, also an arcade port, advances the progress. They progress here by moving from Galaxian to Galaga, which I think is a much better game personally. Galaga, you can see that you actually get to play through a couple of different challenge stages here. And on the bottom right, you can just push start to boot into Tekken once it's loaded. If you want to keep playing Galaga, you can. If you get through all of these stages and get a perfect score, you unlock a Devil Kazuya as a playable character in Tekken. So there's a playable character that's tied to this little mini game on the loading screen, which is obviously really cool, right? And then the last Namco example we have for something of this nature, where it's like an emulated arcade experience prefacing a game, is in Tekken 5. So they continue this through Tekken, where you have Starblade, yet another classic Namco arcade game. So for what it's worth, they really made great use of their arcade backlog of games in this loading screen context. This is just sort of a demo version of Starblade. You can actually, by playing through the story mode in Tekken 5, you can unlock the full arcade game of Starblade for play within Tekken, so that's pretty cool. But it's also worth noting that Namco didn't just limit these preload type minigames to things that had gameplay or to, again, emulated experiences. They would sometimes also just put in little interactive, frivolous things you could just mess around with, like they do in We Love Katamari.
Actually, I wanted to just highlight here.
Oh, sure.
You can see the PS2's load times weren't quite as bad, and like by the time you actually have control of the ship, it's already loaded and it's prompting you to press start. So it's more of a just something for people to play around with than a strictly necessary thing.
Yeah, and also probably so that they could
they
keep holding on to that patent of theirs, which they probably shouldn't have been granted to begin with. So in We Love Katamari, when you're loading it to stages here, you can just control the King of All Cosmos' head as he moves around the screen and spits out either text or random little characters. No benefit to this. It's just a little kinesthetic thing you can fool around with while the game is loading. And then probably the more prevalent series of examples here is in basically every single Namco DBZ game on the PS2. There's like 10 different games in here, so maybe we'll just kind of scrub through the video. But these range in complexity from really basic time wasters like this, where you just mash a button to make Master Roshi spin around, to something like that, where you're mashing a button to make Cybermen grow out of the ground. And they start actually having some mechanics as they go. So in this one, for example, you're playing as Kid Goku climbing up the tower, and eventually you'll get kind of knocked down as you progress, giving you at least some kind of reason to keep trying to climb. And yeah, they really vary in terms of how complex they are. A lot of them are like this, where you're just pushing a button and you're making more things appear on the screen. But you do have something like this here, which is like sort of a breakout kind of block break sort of mini game with Yamcha. So there's really tons of these. Like all of the DBZ PS2 games basically had these. So there was something you could be doing on the loading screens. And again, these are all Namco games, so you can maybe see why they would include them, because they really wanted to hang on to that silly patent of theirs.
And shout outs to DB Xantos.
Yeah, thank you, DB Xantos, for the footage.
So whether or not that patent was enforceable is up for debate, but the fact of the matter is a lot of the major gaming companies, especially Nintendo, have some weird attitudes about anything that could possibly be legally dubious, and I don't think it's a coincidence. In 2015, Splatoon actually has these mini games, which are completely original, but styled as if they were 8-bit.
Yeah.
And you can play these not just from the arcade in the main setting, but while you're waiting for matchmaking. So perhaps still a little bit of a hesitancy to fully violate that expired patent. It did expire in 2015. But yeah, well, matchmaking is basically the same as loading.
We're counting it at the very least.
Pretty similar idea, but there will be more of that later. But
so now that we've
mini games.
Yeah, now that we've taken a look at some of these Namco examples here, we're just going to look at a few tricks that are not exactly loading screens, but are maybe implemented to either prevent or to obfuscate a loading screen.
Yeah, since the most obvious way to keep a player engaged during loading was patented for the era where it was arguably most necessary. There are a lot of little tricks, just optimizations. Big one would be Silent Hill. So Silent Hill has a very, very short draw distance, as you could see here, but it themes it as heavy fog throughout the Silent Hill itself, and that becomes a aesthetic trademark of the series, brought forward into the games where they could easily render the environment as far as you can see without having to make any compromises on frame rate.
Yeah, it's almost one of the things that the series is most known for, right? That fog. It really creates a unique atmosphere. Very memorable.
Yep. Another one in 3D games, another Metroid example here. In the whole Metroid Prime series, I've called out this example in Hunters for reasons that will become evident. There are just loading hallways where it's basically you have this big sprawling room with a lot of complicated 3D objects, and then before you can get into the next one, or going between areas that aren't quite enough for that elevator transition, you'll have a little hallway with doors that you have to manually open, and that basically guarantees it's not going to have both of those big environments loaded at the same time. Now, Metroid Prime Hunters for the DS is one of 2 handheld Metroid Prime games, and the only one that's fully 3D. I just don't want to leave out Metroid Prime Pinball.
Oh, God forbid.
But this is the start of the game, so it has a little scan tutorial to even be able to use this door in the first place. All that's loaded in is the landing pad on this space station, and you have winding loading hallway, and then a second loading hallway with another door that looks the same as the one that you just scanned and the one that opened normally that takes noticeably longer to get into the main room. But it's pretty impressive they had this running on the original DS anyway. It's just definitely, you could tell what's going on behind the scenes there.
Just a daisy chain of loading corridors.
And another interesting example from the Metroid Prime series is in Metroid Prime 2. One of the developers actually tweeted about this a few months ago, but during development, when testing these 2D morph ball based areas, when they had the boost ball upgrade that lets you go much faster, they were falling out of the map as they got into the new rooms. So there are these automatic doors in a lot of rooms that most players would never even see unless they were going back and trying weird stuff with the late game upgrades. But those doors just open on their own. They're distinct from the ones that require a morph ball bomb to open, to whatever that matters for anyone.
We promise.
That's our last Metroid example.
Yeah, we promise. But we obviously you can't mention Metroid without mentioning some Castlevania, right? So Symphony of the Night is another example here, a classic PS1 side-scrolling action game. And it's notable for many reasons, but it's a pretty much fully 2D game on PS1, where PS1 was otherwise engineered mostly for 3D. And since it's loading from a disk, even though it's 2D, it does need to load data. So they have these same kinds of loading hallways that Metroid includes as well. There's nothing really that distinct about the loading hallways in Symphony of the Night, except when looking into this panel, despite having played Symphony of the Night a few times, I noticed for the first time, these hallways have a CD icon in the top middle of the screen there that says CD. So they're pointing out what this is very subtly. Like, yeah, sorry, we're on discs, so we have to load. And Jak and Daxter kind of takes a lot of these basic tricks and kind of combines them. Obviously, it's a big sprawling game with very large open areas. That's evident just from this shot alone. And the game is kind of constantly loading data from the disk as you're playing to prevent you from getting stuck up on those loading screens. But it is possible for you to go too quickly in Jak and Daxter and to outpace that actual physical reading process from the disk. And if you do that, Jak trips. And you're forced to just watch him get back up, takes a few seconds. And that, much like with the Metroid Prime 2 Morph Ball example, it keeps you from outpacing the loaded game geometry and clipping through the world, which obviously you probably don't want to do normally.
Yeah, I think it's pretty funny this clip ends in a hallway that's very similar to the Metroid Prime ones, down to the spiral shutter doors.
Yeah, so a lot of little tricks going on.
Yeah,
there.
so those are the examples of just using gameplay to buffer the necessity to have a full loading screen. We're moving on to some examples of actual loading screens. And one major thing that developers have done is use this as a time to let the players learn either tips about the game or give more information characterizing the nature of things. So
yeah, so we have
classic
Dark Souls
example.
here. Is just a basic example. Plenty of games do this kind of thing. We chose Dark Souls just because it kind of does a couple things at once here. A lot of the story in Dark Souls is conveyed through these item descriptions, and unless you're sort of prudently searching through your menu at all times and reading these, you're going to miss out on a lot of that context. But at the same time,
menus
the items
that don't pause the game, so like you would have to specifically spend time in a safe area to even do that.
Yeah, you need to be in the right context for it. And on top of that, these items all do something, right? So on these loading screens, they present you with the item descriptions as they're shown on the menu ordinarily. And that way you both get the opportunity to read and learn a little bit about the lore and maybe about a certain character or a certain event, while also figuring out, even in just sort of a basic way, what these items actually do within the logic of the game. So obviously, plenty of games use these kinds of tutorial tips on loading screens as a way to kind of ease the loading process and also help better acquaint the player with the game and its experience. This is just sort of a novel one for that hybrid approach. And then Bethesda does the same kind of thing too in a lot of their games. I think a bunch of the Fallouts do this as well. Their loading screens will show you those same kinds of basic tooltips, either with info about the game or about the lore or a faction within the game or a certain mechanic. And then they'll couple that with a model that's associated with that little tooltip that you can actually manually rotate, pin, and zoom in on. I actually didn't know. I've played a ton of Skyrim. I've played a ton of Fallout 3 and 4. I didn't know that you could control the camera in these screens until looking into this. And I kind of wish I had. It's just a nice little, again, kinesthetic thing you can mess around with during loading.
Yep. And aside from just the item descriptions like that, sometimes loading screens just will display stuff about the game that you have more influence over. We just picked Dirt 2 as a particularly aesthetically pleasing example of this. But as your race is loading, it'll have this cool 3D rendered text showing you the other people in the race. And then if it keeps going, it'll start showing you your achievements, in-game stats, what's next? The missions, so your progress. So it's a little more personalized than just the basic item descriptions.
Every Dirt 2 loading screen is personalized.
Dota 2 takes it to the next level with a more interactive example. This is a little mini game that tests your memory of how to build the different items in game, which does ostensibly have some in-game benefit if you're good at repeating this and you get the funny little kill streak announcements. That'll be one less thing to think about during the game. So now a particularly clever way of getting around Namco's patent. It specifically refers to having a second game that you play while the first game is loading, but when so much of that loading time with 3D games is the environment, other characters, just loading in your player character and the basic physics is a bit easier, and the Assassin's Creed series tends to let you play as your character and just practice the basic movement while waiting on new areas to load. This is also sort of a meta example in that in the setting, you're using this technology called the Animus to load your consciousness to these places back in time, and that's what's happening in the narrative as you're waiting on the game to load for technical reasons. Another simple example of just having the primary game mechanics during a loading screen. This time, again, matchmaking is in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. You can practice your moves on the sandbag here. Classic sort of just training mode for fighting games. One interesting thing showing Nintendo's hesitancy to even reach the topic, now that the matchmaking is complete, there is this specific menu. This is where the real loading is happening. So, like, Namco's lawyers, I swear nobody was doing anything fun while the game was loading.
No patents were infringed in the development of this video game. Bayonetta does this same kind of thing, letting you practice your basic actions during the loading screens, but it takes it a step further by actually displaying your different combo inputs and letting you really master the sort of fine-tuned, specific action-based combat that the Bayonetta series is known for. And then in Bayonetta 2, there's actually an exploit kind of associated with these playable loading screens where you have this katana weapon you can use called the Shuraba, which has this 3-stage charge attack, and you can start charging it up in a loading screen, say before a boss fight, and then once that loading screen finishes, you actually carry that charge into the fight through any cutscenes and can immediately just take off like a quarter of a boss's health. So that's pretty cool, right? And what's neat is that this applies at really any transitory loading screen, whether it's going to load you into that playable space or not, or you're just going through a door. You can charge up before the door, open the door, and then you'll end up carrying that same charge through that door, through any cutscenes, right into the fight. So a nice little tip if you're struggling with Bayonetta 2, I guess. Sonic Frontiers takes this even further, in that, you're given access to all of your controls, really. You can play around, but you're given these little challenges that you can complete during loading screens with a specific prompt. And you can even say, it'll tell you at the top of the screen when the loading is done, much like in Tekken, for example. So you don't have to play through this entire thing. But if you want to, and you want to, flex and show off your finesse, you do have the option to play through these little mini games that they'll then rank you on at the top of the screen there.
Yep. One more example, and introducing yet another alternate type of loading screen is for Star Wars Battlefront. Oop, is that?
Yeah, it just takes a sec to play.
Yeah, it's well, the reason it takes that long is because this is actually an installation screen. So after the basic assets necessary to do this kind of thing have installed, it actually lets you start playing as Darth Vader. You got his lightsaber, his force choke, and this reflects the actual controls of the main game, so you don't have to wait for that entire installation of everything to get a taste of that new game that you pop the disc in and we're greeted with a installation screed instead of a title screed.
Yeah, and this is specifically like a horde mode type game that you can play through while the rest of the game is installing.
Yep.
Rayman Legends adds sort of a cooperative, competitive element to these playable loading screens, where when loading between levels, you retain control of your characters. And you actually have this little floating jar that has a heart in it, which gives you an extra hit point. Only one of you can get this if you're playing co-op, though, with a friend. So you can either compete and fight against each other in these little load moments to see who gets that extra hit point going into the level. Or if you need to defer that hit point to somebody who really needs it, maybe you're playing with somebody of lesser skill or somebody who's just taking more hits, you can just pass it off to them in a sort of a cooperative way. So there's that hybrid element going on there, which is really interesting. And then FIFA 17 kind of expands on this as well. I think a bunch of the different FIFA games do this kind of thing. But while you're waiting for a match to load in 17, you get loaded into kind of a miniaturized 2v2 version of a match that you can play with your friend. And you can see, just like in Tekken and some other examples, the game's actually ready to go now. At the bottom of the screen, you can just hit start to boot into the match. But if you want to keep sitting here and just playing, 2v2 mini soccer, you do you.
And if you're like me, you might be wondering, like, once you have all this up, what is left to load? Why is this like this? And you have to remember, you can't just copy and paste these guys however many times for the team. It's got those HD 3D renders of the current athletes, which is the appeal of these being yearly releases.
Yeah, so now that we've taken a look at some loading screens that got around Namco's patent by just showing you either different ways to play the game and interact with it, or by letting you interact with the game mechanics themselves, we'll look at some playable loading screens that are maybe a bit more dubious with regards to Namco's patent, where you're just being presented with a mini game that you can play separate from the actual regular game mechanics. Starting off with another sports game, we've got NBA Live 08 here, a basketball game. And when you're waiting in this game for a match to start up with you and your friend, both of you actually get loaded.
You don't have to be friends.
Yeah, you can play this alone if you want to. I think this guy's actually playing it alone. You get loaded into this little trivia match here with like a great MIDI. For 08, this is kind of weird, but okay. And it's a little trivia game about 2008 era basketball. So if you want to go back and brush up on your 2008 era NBA trivia, here's your option. And then we've also got Test Drive Overdrive on PS2. Up front, there are way better clips of this on YouTube. I just really wanted like the blown out DMX music and this beautiful CRT as well. So again, this is Test Drive Overdrive. It's an entry in the Atari series of test drive racing games. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given that this is Atari, when you're loading into a match, either solo or with a friend, you get the option to play Pong on the loading screen. So if you're solo, you'll be up against an AI. If you're with your friend, you're playing together. A bunch of the other test drive games have this same Pong minigame. Again, we just had to include that DMX bit and these beautiful glowing CRT paddles here. Look at that. It's great.
And I've started hypothesizing about how all this fits into like how different companies approach the patent issue. My theory is that Atari had just been around long enough. They were like, nobody's going to come after us for putting Pong in one of our games.
Yeah, that classic Atari confidence.
So another example of just a simple little interactive loading screen, and maybe harkening back to that patent, we have Devil May Cry 3. You can just mash the button to splash the now loading with weapons for the game. It's sort of interesting. This predates that first Dragon Ball Z example where the main input was mashing buttons. So
I did just source this from a Let's Play. I'm sorry. Shout out to Catrononis, I guess.
And another example of just a full-on violation of the patent, apparently, is Onichanbara. This game is sort of interesting in that it's one of the few Japanese Xbox 360 exclusives. And interesting sound effects. That's a mini game, all right. While researching this, we noticed there was some controversy about whether or not these coins that you're picking up give you any in-game benefit. I believe that it turned out that they're just for score tracker. I'm not really sure why they bothered doing that versus just keeping track of how many zombies you killed, but that brings us seamlessly to our next section where loading screens can have in-game benefit.
Yeah, so kind of tying back to some of those classic Namco games from before where you get actual unlocks in the game, Okami has two different loading screens here where you can unlock a consumable item. This first one, if you push a button here, you can stamp this sheet with a paw print. And if you manage to get 60 stamped before the loading finishes, you get a Demon Fang there, which is a little consumable item used in the game's economy that lets you buy certain items and like passive upgrades and things like that. But obviously 60 is a lot, right? So this other loading screen, 6 little paw prints will appear in a rhythm, and if you can copy that rhythm, you can get another Demon Fang from that. But what's nice about this second screen is you can just keep repeating that pattern as long as the screen is loading. So you can get 5 fangs, 6 fangs, 7 fangs, however many you can get within that time limit. So clearly one of these is mechanically superior, which in these games with mini games and loading that give you a benefit in the game, you don't often see, right? It's just kind of the one and done type thing.
And another example of Nintendo, well after the patent expired, of course, is Animal Crossing Pocket Camp. In this, there's a sort of Dino Run-esque minigame where you're just controlling the camper and can do a really basic jump, and you're just collecting bells while the game's downloading updates. So also sort of an example of installation. But you keep those bells in the main game, and they're not particularly useful compared to the real money premium currency in Pocket Camp, but you do get some benefit from messing around with this while your game's loading. And sort of an inversion of that, where this is clearly worse than the microtransaction currency, Fortnite actually added the ability to customize your loading screen in Season 3. That Reddit post, good stuff, is just talking about they have everything else in the bundle, so it would cost 600 V-Bucks just for the loading screen, which is apparently what it's worth. I don't believe that other than like bundles like this, you specifically purchase them. I think they're more unlocks based on the battle pass and what have you, but there are a lot of different ways to customize your experience. If you're going to be staring at them, you can be reminded of what other huge mega IPs are in the game, but for as harsh as I'm being on this, there are some pretty cool ones.
It all comes back to Tomato Town in the end. Street Fighter 6 takes a sort of classic fighting game loading screen concept and subverts it just a little bit. So ordinarily in fighting games, you both pick your player character, and then you get a little shot of both characters kind of facing each other down while the match is loading, both to show you who's who and to kind of build tension before the fight. And in Street Fighter 6, they still have this. You see both your characters, but you can actually control your character's facial expressions too. Everybody has a couple of canned facial expressions you can just kind of rapidly swap between.
How's this matchup gonna shake out?
So obviously this is just kind of a fun little thing that you can do, but I really like to think that when this game comes out, even if only for a brief window, there will be some kind of a competitive strategy to psyching your opponent out by like puffing Jury's cheeks up or whatever during loading.
And I think it's pretty impressive these models are this realistic that they've found a second Uncanny Valley well after the first one.
Yeah, Capcom really flexing.
It's gonna be exciting to see.
One more example of just a simple little thing to do while the game is loading that will help us get into the next section is in Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, you can actually play as the little robot Tarako jumping around. And this loading screen actually starts off very sparse, but as you unlock more characters from the roster, they'll join and reflect your game progress in that way, which brings us to our next section.
Ludonarrative loading. So this is loading screens that actually manage to affect or implement affect or bolster the plot of the game or the narrative of the game during the loading process. So thinking back to like the Dark Souls example, for instance, we're starting off with Resident Evil here, which has a classic loading transition. Any obviously classic survival horror series starting on the PS1. Anytime you move from room to room in Resident Evil 1, you get these door opening animations kind of in isolation, which help to add to the horror tone
Yeah, it's almost cinematic. It would be like kind of lame if it was the same canned animation each time, but you can see in this very fast video, they're all pretty much unique. There are a couple gates here that, if you can catch it, like are very slightly different. So it's really more of the camera focusing in on these gates, drawing your attention to, like, the previous room is safe, you cleared that out, you're going into the next room, and these rooms are always, or those screens are always kept safe as creepy but calm respite for the player.
Yeah, and they actually use this to great effect in Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, so for people who played the original and were expecting to just kick back and wait till they could take in the next room, that animation is interrupted to great effect.
And then you never know if this is going to happen again or not, which is just incredible.
And now we're going to a little section within a section. I'd like to call it the Elevator Block 2. And I know I said no more Metroid examples, but that doesn't mean no more elevator examples. Real-world loading screens make a return. So in Portal, all the different test chambers are connected by these elevators, which serve as the loading between rooms. And you get ample time for GLaDOS to deliver some of her patented comedic insults to you. Science material emancipation grill will vaporize. Actually, I think this one is just tutorializing, explaining that you can't bring objects from one level to the next. But I'm about to spoil Portal from 2007. If you're unfamiliar with the twist at the end of Portal, please plug your ears for the next 15 seconds or so. At the end of the game, during the escape sequence, you actually get to jump down one of these elevator shafts, which just sort of further subverts the idea that they're just there for loading. Adds to the physicality of Aperture Science Facility. Another way to implement elevators in games is Mass Effect. The original Mass Effect was kind of notorious for how much how many elevators it had to load the different areas, and something interesting about that is for each permutation of party members, there's over 30 minutes total dialogue exclusive to these loading screens that just further serves to characterize all the different characters. So
just elevator small talk.
If you're going to have that many elevators, I think they did a good job justifying it that way.
They worked within their means.
And the finale of the Elevator Block 2 is an innovation possibly better than Metroid Dread's horizontal elevators, and a credit to Gamers Little Playground, of course. But yeah, God of War 2018, we actually talked about this in our panel last year, which was on title screens. So this game has just immaculate presentation. I don't think there's any explicit loading screens anywhere. The title screen itself, you have your menu superimposed over Kratos in the background, and when you start the game for the first time, it literally just zooms in on him and you pick up from what he was doing in the background of the title screen.
Yeah, it's all one camera take, essentially, the game. That's one of the things it's really known for. Even down to menus like this. You can see you put this little gem in this device here, and Kratos is still in the foreground there. There's no cut or away or anything like that.
But yeah, so lest they be accused of just using the elevator to mask loading, there's a little something that they point out about this elevator between realms.
It's crazy to think that all the realms exist in the same space, one on top of the other. It's like this room lets us travel without moving.
So there we have it, the stationary elevator. It's really amazing what technology has gotten us. So.
Such an innovation. Nier uses the loading screen to really enhance the narrative. In Nier, you have this daughter character named Yona who's sort of sick and bedridden throughout the game, but she's a main character. She's sort of the apple of your eye as the protagonist. And to help you sort of grow closer to Yona and keep her relevant, the loading screens will show you little diary entries from her as you're progressing throughout the story, so that you can see what she's up to, what she's thinking, and so that some of the emotional payoff tied to her character has a little bit more resonance with the player. But what's interesting that Nier does is that they also start to kind of subvert these comforting loading screens by peppering in, as you progress through the game, these kind of more sinister, ominous reports that just read in a very sterile way. And they often detail some sort of tragedy or awful incident that took place seemingly way before the setting that the game takes place in. So you get this nice juxtaposition between the friendly Yona diary entries and then the much scarier, darker reports that you start to pick up. And then the Live Alive remake, which is from 2022, also does this same kind of thing in a sort of sinister way. Live Alive, obviously, it's a old Japanese, Japan exclusive RPG from Square that was recently remade for the Switch. The original version did not have any loading screens, but for the remake, they had to incorporate some loading. So they do the classic thing of putting in some tutorial text on these sorts of screens just to teach you about the game, give you tool tips, tell you how to fight certain enemies. But in one chapter of Live Alive that's very heavily themed on 2001: A Space Odyssey, in this chapter there's like an AI that takes over a ship and starts tormenting its crew. In this one loading screen in this chapter, the AI actually takes control of the loading screen and delivers a cryptic message to both the player character and the player. I don't think this happens anywhere else in the remake, and it's obviously not present in the original game, which is really fascinating. This is the only example I can think of this kind of loading screen twists that's been implemented sort of after the fact in a game remake. And it's very sinister.
Yep. Another example of the loading screen tooltips being subverted into more ominous messages is in Spec Ops: The Line. And it has various anti-war messages that contrast with the satirical but still somewhat played straight within the game's own narrative, Middle Eastern war main plot. So it's told you bad stuff about the U.S. military. And there's one at the end that I really like that kind of goes back to the tooltip idea. It's defining the game mechanic of cognitive dissonance for you. So a much lighter example of subversion, a bit of backstory. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is the semi-sequel to the original Stanley Parable, which is a very satirical and funny game. It takes place in an abandoned office, and you have this narrator character. It's suggesting where you go, and he'll react if you deviate from that. There's a lot of different endings. This is one of the new endings with the metatextual ultra deluxe version sort of serving as commentary on modern gaming's tendency to re-release things as remastered versions. And check it out if you haven't heard of it. I like it a lot. But at the end here, you have this little meta. They finished catching up to the present with the history of Stanley Parable, and that's the end of what could be considered the primary narrative of the Ultra Deluxe.
No, I'm not done. I'm not ready to move on. Stop the loading screen. Isn't there some way we can stay here and keep enjoying these figurines? Let's just go backwards. We'll do the memories again from the opposite direction. See how that feels.
It's genius. Why load a new level where you can just go backwards through the same level?
And that brings us to our final section, Loading Legends. These are some of our favorite examples, which also just defy categorization. This first one's sort of similar in genre to Stanley Parable. This is more Portal-esque in that it's a puzzle game, and it plays a lot with perspective. So this is just the standard loading screen, the first one you see. After you've done some of the perspective puzzles, this will happen. So it's as if it's on the two sides of a cube that you're now looking at, and then it just kind of messes with your expectations more for there as the game gets more surreal.
For the rest of the game, they're just messing with you from this point on. And we're just going to there's like 3 or 4 more of these. We're just going to let all these go through. I think this one's your favorite, right?
Yeah.
Oh, just wait. Yeah, they get a lot of use out of these.
This one's simple, but I like it a lot.
You can just scale this one up, too, which is great.
But the fact they didn't almost is what I like.
Oh, wait, this one's my favorite. It's so stupid. I wish all loading bars were like that. So yeah, next up we have Tunic. And this isn't necessarily a loading screen or a loading trick per se. I just really wanted to highlight this because this is one of the most unique instances of loading as a mechanic that I've ever seen. Tunic's probably my game of the year for 2022. I played it like a month ago with no expectations, and I was totally blown away. In Tunic, the manual for the game is diegetic. It's part of the game itself. And when you start the game, you don't have a manual. You're finding the pages of the manual as you play through the game. And as you can see here, the manual is cryptic. It's conveyed in kind of a cipher. There's this fake language. There's also some English text. And then there's also iconography as well, so that you can kind of intuit what certain sections of the manual mean or are trying to say. But Tunic is full of puzzles. It's full of intrigue. And the manual peppers in tons of hints and curiosities that you're intended to kind of notice and pay some attention to. So you can see on the bottom left here, your little fox character is kind of puzzled by something on the loading screen. And what you're meant to do when you notice that is to go back to the loading screen after you've gotten that page. I never loaded a game when I was playing this. I just always continued. If you load after finding that page, you have a save file there that's like totally stacked. It has like 999 hours of playtime. It has more things unlocked than you can actually unlock in the game. And when you load into this file, you're brought into this infinitely looping hallway from a top-down perspective, which doesn't happen anywhere else in the game. You can't get to this hallway in the game. You can't get out of this hallway once you've loaded into it here without just quitting out and loading your normal file. And what this is a cryptic hint for a gigantic puzzle that's sort of present throughout all of Tunic. I'm showing this because this doesn't spoil anything on its face. This is one part of a multi-part puzzle. But I can't think of any other time in a game that in order to fully complete the game, I've had to load a file that wasn't mine in order to figure out the answer to a puzzle based on a pseudo-specific hint that I got in the game. It's just a whole lot at once, and I had to throw this in here just for that. So this is like the one gimme. This one here, the video really speaks for itself, so we're going to let it play, but this is Todd Howard talking with Larry Herb, Phil Spencer, and Pete Hines about the Microsoft and Bethesda acquisition. And Todd here tells us about one of his favorite loading techniques, we'll say, that they implemented when developing Morrowind for the original Xbox specifically.
I think my favorite one in Morrowind is you can actually, if you're running low on memory, you can reboot the original Xbox and the user can't tell. You can throw like a screen up. So when Morrowind loads, sometimes you get a very long load. That's us rebooting the Xbox.
It's called memory management.
So there you go. They were turning the console off and on without you knowing. Crazy. MGS4, this one's just kind of funny. This was an early PS3 game that has a lot of content. And when you reach certain points in the game, you have to then install the next segment of the game in order to keep playing. So you're greeted with these little screens of Snake, old Snake specifically, smoking a cigarette. And depending on how long it takes you to install the next segment, he'll just plow through these things like it's nobody's business.
He was actually young Snake before he started smoking.
Yeah, this is at the start. This is after like several load screens. So you get these little tooltips here that give you health precautions, and they tell you to like you throw your cigarette butts out in an ashtray. There's some gameplay tooltips as well that come up that'll kind of breeze past here, but these can obviously take a while, these install screens, depending on how much data is installing. And I just, I'm sure he's enjoying the process, but I just look at him go. By the end of this game, you've gone through like 3 cartons of Marlboros. It's crazy. And something that kind of that enhances this just a little bit. In MGS1, it was actually a 2-disc game on PS1. And when you reach the end of the first disc, you get a call from your little buddy Otacon saying, hey, it's time to change to disc 2. Go ahead and pop out the first disc and put the other one in. In MGS4, you end up going back to the setting from MGS1. And when you reach that same point in 4, where in 1 you would have needed to change the disc, Otacon calls you and says, all right, Snake, it's time to go ahead and change over to disc 2 so we can... Oh, wait a minute, we're on the PS3. We don't have to change the disc. It's all on one disc. We're on Blu-ray. So they're on Blu-ray, but you still have to spend like an hour total just installing these sections of the game while Snake slowly kills himself. It may have just been better to have a second disc, guys. I don't know, honestly.
I think for this one, we don't really have an explanation so much as an apology, but...
Yeah, let me pump the volume up.
So it's not really clear from this, but you can change the pitch of these sounds with the controller if you want to.
If you want to.
You have to want to do it.
It's opt-in.
I mean, I guess you could do it accidentally, but it's hard to assign agency to that.
So that's done. We're also sorry for this one. This is Idolmaster 2 on the 360. It speaks for itself. It's not done. All right, now it's done. Just kidding.
I find it fascinating they thought it was important to vary the animations, but have this, like, 7-second loop or whatever.
Hey, my
And
friend,
this speaks for
nice
itself.
to stop by. You must have come to see this beautiful loading screen. Oh, you were looking for a game to play. Well, before you can start your game, you gotta spend some time here waiting first. Yeah, I see you're excited. Because this loading screen is a true masterpiece. Just look at the design, the colors, that red cross. I think I'm in love. Whoa, what did you do? You broke it. Now put that window back in place. Don't make me call your mother.
Yeah, something interesting, aside from the fact
You
this was
broke it, you fix
2018,
it.
despite being very, like, mid-noughts Newgrounds
Let me secure
style,
this.
was they actually were trying to kickstart this
Let
into
you
an
do
even
it.
bigger game.
Let's hope that nothing got damaged.
That's a shame. I think I would have backed that if I had known about that when it was active.
Yeah, it didn't get off the ground, but it's, it's a curious thing to see, kind of anachronistic for 2018, but whatever. It's neat. And with that, loading's done. Thank you all so much.